talk today about fermented foods. I'm going to say a few things about why fermented foods matter, and then I'm going to demonstrate the preparation of a few simple fermented foods that you can make at home. We know, and I'm sure you're familiar with, the fact that we're losing a lot of plant and animal biodiversity on the planet. If you look at a place like the Amazon rainforest, we're all aware that the forest is being cut down and that has an impact on the health of the whole planet, and that we're losing a lot of different species of plant and animal biodiversity. The same exact thing is happening inside our body. The same exact process is happening inside the human gut. And believe it or not, we are only about 10% human. The rest of us, the other 90%, is a whole constellation of different microorganisms that we host, and we have what's called a symbiotic relationship with them. In other words, we support their life and they support our life, and they support our life by boosting our immune system and strengthening our digestion and reducing inflammation in the body. And we have lost a lot of the diversity of our gut flora. They reside primarily in the gut. And we've lost that through various factors. We've lost it from eating a lot of processed foods, refined sugar, refined flour, rancid fats, and so on. We've lost it through exposure to toxic chemicals in our environment that reduce our immune response. We've lost it through the stress of our modern industrial lifestyle. And we've also lost it in part through the chronic use of antibiotic drugs. So all of these different factors have conspired to basically threaten, you could say, the rainforest, so to speak, inside our human gut. So historically, cultures all around the world have eaten fermented foods for millennia. And I'll bet that perhaps your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents, there was somebody in your family that had some kind of fermented food that they liked to eat. And people didn't used to have to worry about things like replenishing gut flora. It just was never part of the conversation when people were eating from the land that they lived on and eating foods that were minimally processed. But now we have to actually start thinking about these things and paying conscious attention to replenishing our gut flora. So I love fermented foods. They're really wonderful. They're very, very easy to prepare. And there's another piece, too, about fermented foods that I find particularly interesting. This module of the class series I have called Feeding the Ancestors. And that, to me, refers to the ancestors, the gut flora that lives in our human gut. And I refer to them as ancestors because they have been part of human evolution ever since humans have begun evolving. And they've been part of us for millennia. And again, I think the crisis in our modern lifestyle has made it such that we don't really think about, where we come from or what our place on this earth is, so to speak. And it's important to pay attention to feeding this part of our being, that it's not just us that we're feeding, but it's also part of a whole human commons, if you will. So I want to talk a little bit about the health benefits of fermentation. Primarily, if you think about the human gut as being the center of our body, it's the center of our physical body. The gut also is the center of our health. And it's the center of our illness. When the body has to fight to digest the food that we're putting into it, when it can't break down, for example, let's say the gluten in wheat, or it can't break down the lack of fiber in a processed refined flour, or the sugar that we're putting in that isn't natural to our bodies. When our body is struggling to break down food, it will release inflammatory signals through the body. And that leads not only to overweight, but to a whole host of degenerative diseases. So fermented foods altogether have an anti-inflammatory effect on the body. They generally help to cool down the digestive tract and facilitate digestion in various ways. If you suffer from food binges and cravings, like you really have a hard time giving up sugar, and you try and try and try and you can't quite do it, it's not your fault. If we have what we call gut dysbiosis, so if we have an imbalance in our gut flora such that the pathogenic bacteria, the bad guys, outnumber the good guys, the beneficial flora, if we have that kind of imbalance, we are biologically vulnerable to the food that we crave because those pathogenic bacteria want to survive. And the way that they survive is that they tell you, their host, go get that chocolate chip cookie, go get that pint of ice cream. So you don't have to blame yourself. You can say the gut bacteria are doing it. So our task then, if we want to help reduce binges and cravings, what was helpful is to begin eating more and more fermented foods, especially at the beginning of the day, because that will help keep our blood sugar in balance. And then it's not such a matter of willpower to resist those cravings. Our body will just let them go naturally. It's really helpful to eat a diversity of fermented foods. And how fermented foods work, generally speaking, is that we have a food and we introduce some kind of culture to the food. So for example, the most common fermented food, one that I'm sure you're familiar with, is yogurt. You have milk that you heat to a certain temperature, and then you introduce certain beneficial bacteria that find a very friendly environment in that milk, and then they proliferate, and the milk becomes sour, and it becomes thick, and it becomes kind of tangy. But from one fermented food to another, each one will attract different strains of beneficial bacteria. So it's good, for example, not to just eat yogurt or not to just take a probiotic, but to really have a diversity in your diet. Because again, what we're looking for is to repopulate the biological diversity of our digestive tract. And the more diverse and the more populated our guts are with beneficial flora, the more they're going to squeeze out those pathogenic bacteria and say, okay, you guys, go away, and they'll go away. And then our health improves and our cravings reduce and we can lose weight and so on. The other thing I want to say, the one last point I want to make, is that fermented foods are really easy to make at home. They're super easy. And you might think, well, what happens if the sauerkraut turns black, or what happens if the kombucha explodes? Don't worry about it. It's really hard to screw them up. And if you screw them up, it's not the end of the world. You can just either start over, or you can just kind of fix it and it's fine. So I hope you'll come with me on this little adventure. I'm going to make a couple of different types of fermented foods here, and I hope you'll try some at home and be in touch with me and let me know how it goes for you, and if you have any questions about it, I'm really happy to answer those. Thank you so much. Let's get started.